My name is Alex Yuen. I'm a lecturer in urban design at the Department of Urban Planning and Design at the Graduate School of Design. For us, the challenge has always been how do we integrate generative AI into our existing workflows in a way that enhances the work, but doesn't necessarily replace our own human agency and our own decision-making ability. It wasn't until about halfway through the semester when a lot of the students had picked up a lot of the techniques that we have to kind of front load in the semester that I started to feed it out there and start to say, hey, we should look at these sort of softwares. In fact, at one point, we took a moment of class to basically pair up and say, okay, let's use these tools, work with a partner, see what you come up with. And in about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, we shared kind of a lot of kind of our experiences, quick takeaways. And I think that really helped get the discussion going. So here you see work from Nana Komaria, who's a Master's of Architecture student. She was looking at the city of Tokyo, and she's developed a rather abstract, non-specific location in Tokyo, but something that's quite familiar to people, this sort of low-density urbanism, very intimate street setting, very local feel next to much larger steel and glass buildings that represent a much more international sort of architecture and development. So on the left, you see the initial prototype of the image. So the images you see are the same process that we've used even before AI had kind of appeared on the scene. But all the work at the beginning is about setting up the scenes, trying to set up a certain perspective, a certain kind of condition. And so we use our spatial skills as architects, planners, urban designers, landscape architects to imagine what that is. So the left is really a sketch, and it's all human generated. As you move towards the right in the image labeled model, this is when Nana starts to incorporate a lot of the more detailed aspects of the scene, and she's able to model out some of these conditions that she's talking about more broadly. The third image called render is when we apply the rendering software. So this is when we start to add lighting, you start to get shadows cast, materials, you see some reflection. And then the final one is render plus post. So we take the render and we put it into Photoshop. In Photoshop, we can control a lot of the colors, we can control a lot of the ambiance, the contrast, we can add other details. And this is where we find that generative AI is starting to really help our process, because there's one detail in particular which really ties this image together, which is the reflections on the ground. And you can see in the previous one where it says render, the reflection is basically a reflective material that was sort of a large blob-like kind of puddle, whereas the one on the right uses AI to generate a much more organic, a much more natural reflective condition. So this is just one example of something where that effect in particular, if we were to try to do that ourselves, it would take a lot of time and probably a lot of failure before we actually got there. And it might draw away from the kind of overall impact of the image. Whereas here we're able to actually test and try these effects really quickly, and they look quite convincing. Another example of this is Mojtaba Nabavi's image of Black Rock City, which is an informal settlement where Burning Man happens every year in the Nevada desert. So instead of modeling every single RV, camper van, and tent, Mojtaba has essentially created these proxies, which you see in the image called model, which are just basic shapes. They don't necessarily designate what those elements or those tents or RVs look like, but they show where they are and kind of create a larger formation. And then when he gets to render, he started to incorporate the generative AI tools to actually replace those proxies with photorealistic images of these same elements. So that's where you start to see a little bit more definition in terms of the tents and the RVs. And then finally, in the last image called render and post, he's taken that previous image and then used, again, the generative AI tools, particularly in Photoshop, to add this sandstorm effect, which, similar to the previous one, is an atmospheric effect that is hard to get right if we were to do this ourselves, but the AI is able to do that very convincingly and very rapidly. I think that the most important thing when it comes to approaching generative AI is it is okay to use these things. We should be exploring them, but it's also critical that we talk about and we discuss our findings afterwards. We want to think about all the potential outcomes or the potential possibilities. Sometimes they're too optimistic, sometimes they're too pessimistic, but by actually applying them to something physical, and in this case, something visual, we can then use the outcome of the process to really kind of push our discussion forward.